Oui, oh bien, l'expression de plaisir et surtout de plaisir du texte est sinon ambiguë, disons incertaine à bien des égards. Parce que d'abord, il est évident que le plaisir de la lecture est très différent selon les sujets, n'est-ce pas? Un tel s'ennuie à un texte qu'un autre aime beaucoup et réciproquement, et il est donc extrêmement difficile de proposer une sorte de loi générale du plaisir de la lecture. C'est là une première incertitude.
Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. This is Wood Art, and in today's video I'm going to talk about Death of the Author, which was introduced by Roland Barthes in 1967 and its use inside the fandom's view of fictional works. As a little disclaimer before continuing, it's not my intention to forward my analysis as the absolute truth.
You can't handle the truth!
Different arguments concerning this concept have emerged since the moment it was introduced, and they've been offered by people much more prepared and certainly more capable than myself. It's my desire in presenting this theory and my personal belief to bring the viewer closer to this specific Barthesian theory in its most basic and rudimentary form and to state my own appreciation of it. Literature, or even beyond, social studies lack the conclusive rigor that other science possess. In them, and in a crudely explained way, 2 plus 2 does not necessarily mean 4, because the answer is dependent on the interpretation of the social, economic, political, and cultural spheres of each subject. In order to exemplify this theory, I'll be using Shakespeare's play The Merchant of Venice and its transposition of 2004 of equal title. It's to be noted that this film was also subjected to, quote, the reader's perspective of the play, and in spite of respecting the overall dialogues and structures, this transposition was influenced by historical events and ideological viewpoints, so the comedic tone that was intended in the original play morphed, categorizing this film into what can be understood as a tragedy. As introduced, Death of the Author is a theory created by Barthes in 1967. Roughly speaking, it's presented as a juxtaposition to the idea that the author, as a metaphorical god, has imbued the text with a single meaning. What Barthes does by presenting this idea is to argue against the power that the author continues to have inside the text because, as he says, writing is the destruction of every voice. Therefore, imposing the author on a text limits its meanings, as the only one true meaning exists, which is the one author God gave it.
Hasta la vista, baby.
Barthes' concept isn't without logic. If the reader does not bring the fictional product, situation, or character to their own perspective, that is, their individual reality, it's impossible to give it verisimilitude. Only through this process can we appropriate fiction. And we can't appropriate it in the same parameters or spheres of understanding of the author. What Barthes says is that the textual meaning can't be located in its origin, but rather in its destination. Thus, readers are constantly working to create the meaning of a text. The main issue with this perspective is that it implies that the relationship with the text is bipartite, as the text either exists in relation to its creator or in relation to its reader. It also implies that a work of literature, as Barthes calls it, a tissue with signs, is of no more value than a user's manual or a flyer, as they too contain signs to communicate information. The most important thing about this essay, however, is the notion that a fictional work stops being from the author the moment they write the last paragraph, as it now belongs to the readers. In this process, each reader performs a different work, as they bring their own ideology to the text. The existence of the relationship between text and reader is unquestionable, but it doesn't exist in a void. In order to believe, we have to detach the text from the author's intent. It's true that we can read a work without knowing the author's name, nationality, and social and economic background, but we see their ideological position through their creation, as all of these aspects we don't know about were intrinsic to the text at the time of its creation and development. This is not to say that the author's intention will be 100% understood or will translate as intended to every reader, but their death isn't as spontaneous nor as definitive as some might think.
To give a text an author is to impose a limit on that text, to furnish it with a final signified, to close the writing. Such a conception suits criticism very well. The latter, then, allotting itself the important task of discovering the author beneath the work. When the author has been found, the text is explained. Victory of the critic.
The thing about this phrase is that the critics Barthes speaks of no longer exist, as they don't hold the same level of power inside literary works as they used to. In order to understand what he meant, we need to take into account the context in which he wrote the piece and the intention behind it. That is, we should ask Barthes what he meant, and if he denies those that go against his original intention, he's contradicting the principle. Literary discourse is opposed to truth. Truth as in the culturally affirmed truth. This distinction between truth and fiction allowed the author to avoid the appropriation that overwhelmed science discourses. Michel Foucault, who like Barthes was against structuralism and opposed the concept of expression, asked the question as to why the author even assumed the position of the ideological figure. That, Foucault stated, resulted from considering the author to be the source of meaning, that is, authorial intention. That's the reason why Foucault and Barthes both oppose this method of closed reading. As the author functions as the figure who controls meaning, his mystification in this regard is linked to the control of distribution and profits. Now, the power is no longer of the critics Barthes antagonized, but with the masses' interpretation of the text, which is not one but multiple ones, as not one reading stays the same in the vast ocean of consumers. It's there that the debate starts, and it's there that the debate ends, because it becomes the let's agree to disagree ad infinitum. There's, again, no exact reason why the debate should have an ending, as the text trespasses time, and its reading is modified by historical events that impact the cultural spheres. If the reader approaches the text by taking ownership of the story and its characters and decides, for instance, to give a character what they truly deserve, then they strip that character of their overall value. A character exists within the story for a purpose, and if we strip Shylock of the context Shakespeare wrote him for, he loses his long-term importance as he exists as the opposing force in the narrative. If he suddenly has nothing to oppose, then he ceases to exist as Shylock. If he is suddenly given a happy ending, as him obtaining the pound of flesh from Antonio's heart, or him rebelling against Antonio's and Portia's revenge request, Portia, as a lawyer, not only saved Antonio's life, but also gave him the retribution she thinks he deserves, he stops being the tragic character and loses the relevance. By taking away a character's place in the narrative and giving them a new story, personality, or actions which the reader thinks a specific character should have had, readers create an entirely new character inside an entirely new story and framework that simply shares some vague similarities to its canon counterpart. Furthermore, they're not giving the character what they deserve, they're giving their own character, as the story is nothing but their own interpretation, what they think they deserve. In the same manner, the author is no longer relevant or talented, as now the brilliance lies in the reader's interpretation of the writing, not in the author's work that apparently simply allowed the readers to reach their brilliance. However, ironically, it's in that sense that the author lives on, as they cannot die. They transcend. Two new approaches to a story, Watsonian and Doyle's, are layers to this issue. The former implies that we can answer questions about the story by simply looking inside the work's universe and not outside it, whilst the latter is concerned with the answers outside the framework of the text, meaning in real life. If a person considers the Watsonian approach as the only well-founded one, then that means that the answers are subjected to the reader's interpretation, which, as I've said, are many. With this approach, the truth, implying that the text has a singular meaning, does not exist, or rather, there isn't a single truth, as there is a coexistence of truths. If, however, they decide to see the story through the Doylist approach, the reader assumes they know the one and only intention of the author, yet that author died, as the person that returns to critique the work is different from the person that actually wrote it. So how do we know the author's true intention? Even the use of interviews to state what the author's intention was and whether they did or not achieve it is debatable, because the interviews are clippings of conversations not chosen by the authors themselves, but by PR teams. Never mind the fact that if there are many of these PR members, the author can appear to contradict themselves or be untruthful. So how do we try to, and try is a keyword in this, reconcile the author's intent with the authors themselves? We look at the story and its framework, and at the structure and the plot as a whole. Shakespeare's narrative introduces Shylock as the antagonist. We aren't supposed, in a very generic manner, to care for him or his destiny, because what we should want is Antonio's safety. Yet Shakespeare, who again built Shylock as the opposition to the framework's stance, gave him the strongest, most human speech inside the story. We're given his perspective. We are told of Antonio's mistreatment towards him, and we are forced to learn the reasoning behind his animosity.
He hath disgraced me and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated mine enemies, and what's his reason? I am a Jew!
Shylock exists as a villain-like figure, yet villain Shylock doesn't exist outside this speech. The reason why we care for Shylock is that we know about his pain, and we know about his pain because Shakespeare allows us to see it. The reader gave Shylock complexity because the complexity existed prior to the reader's intervention. It's, however, the reader that vindicates him, but they didn't do it alone. Characters aren't independent from the author's decision-making process. They can, however, influence the author's initial thought process. Readers can't blame the author and spare the characters from any responsibility, as they are the vehicle the author uses inside the story. When the reader says the problem isn't the character's actions but rather the narrative justifying it, they're arguing against the author's intention, as that's the reason why the framework even exists. The framework contradicts the reader. It doesn't validate them, but it acknowledges their potential existence, as the reader isn't born until after the writing. And even so, neither the story nor the character or the author has to endorse the reader's views, because that doesn't diminish the work's value. There are many ways in which a reader becomes frustrated with the story. A very common route of this event transpires when the consumer finds the ending dissatisfying. The dissatisfaction with the conclusion, and I'm using that word as reading or engaging with any form of art is both an ideological and emotional process, does not detract from the brilliance of the plot. If we decide to forever and ever separate the Watsonian and Doyle's perspectives, to study them in a manner that they shouldn't interact, because we are so sure about the author's sole intention and that intention contradicts the story itself as it didn't convey it properly, then we take the events that fit our perspective of the text as mere coincidences. Furthermore, we kill the author because our brilliance, our appreciation, our writing of the story is better. The reader becomes the author's murderer by divine right. The children rebel against their parent, who metaphorically create them for that specific fictional universe, and they murder them, creating at last the creature, the text, the inheritance that is rightfully theirs. Detractors of the theory accuse Doa of becoming a means for cultural erasure. In their words, if they're going to read everything of themselves into the work, then what happens to the cultures that are told through art? Is their art meant to be repackaged, remodeled, erased for the reader to find their brilliance through fiction? There's a case that perfectly exemplifies this, where a Western portion of a fandom considered a character to be femininely designed because of his use of makeup. Yet, if we look further inside the same story and the author's origins, we can easily draw a connection in between the specific character's design and kabuki theater, where actors use kumadori in bright colors in order to emphasize veins, muscles, blood vessels, or the connection of the samurai to a kami, becoming itokami. The lack of knowledge from Western readers about Japanese culture prevented them from seeing the reasoning behind specific aesthetic choices, giving sense to a specific design by coding it feminine instead of tracing down its conceptual roots. But with all of these points made, one question arises. If the author's intention doesn't necessarily translate into the readers, then which text is more important? Is the text to be read as the author intended or as the reader interprets it? Could both of these visions coexist, or are they bound to fight for dominance indefinitely?